Welcome back. This video is a review of the Dungeon World game by Sage Kobold Productions. Now, I'd initially not planned to look at Dungeon World since I'm not a massive fan of the dungeon crawl, as evidenced in my previous RPG Bugbears video on the subject. You can find that in my RPG Bugbears playlist. Now, this game is based on Apocalypse World, which I've no real direct experience of, but I gather is a easy to run post-apocalyptic style setting. Dungeon World takes the rules that have been designed for this game and fits them to a more old school D&D vibe. Now, the introduction to the book is a standard fantasy adventure fare, and then after that it launches pretty much straight into the classes. There's some fairly evocative prose descriptions of the classes. Each has a striking but simple and easily identifiable rune to represent them. This is a great way to easily pick up when the text is referring to a certain class. The descriptions do seem to have a distinct slant towards combat and treasure gathering, which I suppose I shouldn't be surprised about in a game called Dungeon World. However, it even has this for classes such as the Druid, but again, I suppose this is to be expected. However, I must say, it did do a very good job of stirring up some old school enthusiasm in me about classes that are by no means new to me, and in some instances have become quite tired over the years that I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons / Pathfinder / whatever. Classes in the new game included are the standard Bard, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Paladin, Ranger, Thief, and Wizard. These are the more traditional classes from D&D, omitting some of the newer introductions like Sorcerer, etc. Now, there's a very interesting section which asks, why play Dungeon World? And the game does a very good job of laying this out. Chapter 2 talks about the actual mechanics of playing a Dungeon World game, and is a standard, this is how an RPG works chapter. Although again, it's extremely well written and quite easy to read. The game seems to boil most actions down to what it calls a move, and this forms the most basic unit of rules in Dungeon World. Initially, I was a little bit concerned that having this sort of element would stymie creativity and result in a very samey game, but the book does a good job of allaying these fears, portraying moves as a simplified mechanic that underlies rather than replaces whatever a character wants to do. Now, I like the fact that the dice rolls and the tests come down to rolling just 2d6 and adding a relevant score to it. If you get 10 or more, then you get the best outcome. 7 to 9 is a success but with some sort of compromise or a complication, and 6 or lower is some sort of severe trouble. Now, I love games that have a central core mechanic like this, since it means that once you've learnt it, you don't have to look it up again just to apply it against situations in a game. And I'm a tremendous fan of anything that reduces book flipping during a session. However, I do fear that a discussion of moves and how they work becomes a little cluttered and confused later on in the book, as it goes into more detail discussing some of the individual moves themselves. I was certainly scratching my head at a couple of them, and they prove logical enough, but the language and the writing of the chapter makes them sound a little more confusing than it needs to, in my opinion. Harm and healing is fairly standard for anyone who's played D&D, or really any other sort of hit point based RPG, but the discussion of how it works is neatly laid out and presented in a nice straightforward fashion. Of some interest, however, is that when a character is reduced to 0 XP, previously a figure that had struck role players' minds with fear and terror and had them reaching for the dice to roll up a new character, this isn't necessarily the case within Dungeon World. When a player reaches 0 hit points in this game, they immediately make a last breath roll, which is a roll that involves no stat modifier, and it follows the normal roll pattern as I described earlier. And this either results in you cheating death if the roll is good, or dying if the roll is a failure. However, if you hit that mid-ground where the complications occur, a personification of death himself appears and offers the player who lingers on the point of losing a character, offers their character a bargain. Accepting the bargain results in stabilization. Refusal results in them moving on to whatever lies beyond this world. What this bargain is left up to the games master and their discretion. I also like a suggestion in this chapter that once a character's inevitable death has been established, the player and the GM can collude to have the character not die immediately, but at a suitably dramatic point. This is a really nice idea. So, for instance, if a character dies in a fairly unheroic or just plain old unfortunate way, the GM can say to the player, "You have been marked for death, your character will die." However, he can allow the character to continue with the understanding that when they reach a more suitably heroic juncture, that character will meet his end. And this is good because it means the player character knows that it's coming, the player knows that it's coming, and it means you can work together to ensure they get the heroic death that they both want and probably deserve. Now, Magic, unsurprisingly, Dungeon World, which seems to be trying to capture an old school D&D feeling, uses the fire and forget system of Vancian magic. Now, this isn't really anything that bothers me tremendously. I know some people aren't a fan of it. Personally, I prefer spell point based systems, but I can see why they would choose to use Vancian magic in this system, and it follows a very similar format. You have the spell engrams or patterns stored in your mind, you memorize them at the start of the day, and when you use them, that pattern, that energy is gone from your mind until you memorize them again. Now, character advancement in the game works on an XP accumulation system, unsurprisingly, but there is a nice description of how players could change within the fiction of a game as they gain abilities on their character sheet. This is something that's often overlooked in games, I think. I know I've been guilty of overlooking it, and I'll be trying to keep this in mind in the future of my games. Dungeon World does a really good job of encouraging you to think about how, once you've gained extra abilities, how is this reflected in how you actually play the character. I also like the fact that the game enshrines you being rewarded XP for acting in a manner appropriate to your alignment. The game using lawful, good, neutral, evil, and chaotic as possible alignments, and you also get XP for resolving inter-party bonds. And these concepts are very much held at the heart of the game, and I think that's going to be a good thing. Next up, there's a section called The Adventurer's Life, and this section discusses the more common areas and events that occur in an adventurer's life. These include dungeons. Now, although I was filled with a little trepidation when I started to read this section, there's actually some good advice here about portraying a dungeon as a living environment, although for my liking there's a bit too much emphasis on death traps, something that I'm not really a fan of, and they seem quite unnecessary in games to my mind. Monsters, which offer some common sense advice and tips about how to run monsters in the game, very well written. Wilderness section and the section called Friends and Enemies. Now, both of these sections contain a couple of short paragraphs each with a bit of flavour text for the subject in question. Nothing particularly to write home about, but it does provide a nice taster for someone who may have less experience at gaming, so that's to be encouraged. The World. A few more flavour snippets, but it does emphasise that in this game the heroes are a big deal. They are the exception rather than the rule. Following on from this, there's an example of play, and this is a solidly written example of a game, and it does a good job of fleshing out some of the concepts mentioned in the preceding chapters. We then get on to the meat of the game, the start of the game, which is character creation, and in order to do this you choose a class. The game recommends not having two people with the same class, and each class has its own character sheet, which leads you on to make further choices such as race, name, look, which is your character's physical appearance, and your stats. Your stats, you're given scores of 16, 15, 13, 12, 9 and 8 to allocate to your stats as you will, and some guidelines are given for ensuring that your character can be good at what you want them to be. I quite like this because after all, people want to make the character that they have pictured in their mind's eye, and not to be saddled with something just because of system restrictions, or at worst, poor stat rolling. If a player wants to play a character with a low stat, because that's the character they envision, more power to them, and the GM should be prepared to run with that. However, You don't want to play a character with a low stat just because you've been lumped with it or forced to take it. In the same way as I wouldn't want to play a character on a high stat in, say, strength for no other reason than that was a random roll I got. Now, if I'm planning on playing a weak-limbed apprentice who's never been out of the library, a strength score of 16 or 17, or even the hallowed 18, doesn't really make much sense. The stats all have modifiers, which will be very familiar to those who play D&D, and there's a little table provided for that. You then set your maximum hit points, which are your constitution score, plus your class's base hit points. You then get on to picking moves for the game, and our moves, as I said earlier, are the most basic unit of action within the game. There are some starting moves listed on the class sheets, and some of the classes have choices on them where you can pick which moves you wish to have. These are all clearly written on the character sheets provided. Next, you choose your alignment. There'll be a scattering of equipment on your class character sheet, which you can make some selections from. And the game then goes on to describe how you should introduce your character. This is a great idea, and it's something that I do already in some of my games, but it's nice to have it written there in the main book. You should talk about your character to the other players and the GMs. It's a good time for the GM or the players to ask questions, useful for filling in backgrounds, establishing PC relationships, and your reasons for adventuring as a party. The next part is choosing bonds. This bit is quite interesting, and it encourages the players to fill in the blanks in a small paragraph describing their relationships with several of the other players. You can have more than one bond with a single PC, and apparently there are some game mechanics that require you to use a number of bonds to a particular person as a modifier for your dice rolls. These would appear to be social rolls, manipulation rolls, etc. And I think that's a great way of representing such bonds. Having that little paragraph there in the corner of your character sheet for you to look at as a little summarization is a great idea. We then move on to Chapter 4 that details the various moves that feature in the game. Basic moves are situations that arrive frequently, and special moves are ones that come up occasionally. Now, all characters have access to the basic and special moves, and there are also specific ones related to class. The moves themselves are a mix of standard combat options and clarifications of some other sorts of situations, such as defying danger and discern realities, which seems to be a search, spot and intelligence check all rolled into one, that crop up regularly in a D&D-esque game. Some of the moves, though, are quite inspired in my opinion. For example, the carouse move. This is a great thing. When you get back from an adventure, although only when you return in triumph, obviously you're not going to carouse if you return with your head held low in shame after a brutal defeat. You can spend 100 coins, coins being the basic monetary unit of the game, and getting a +1 modifier for each additional 100 coins spent on the roll. And your roll determines how many options from a list of things such as befriend a useful NPC, hear a rumour of an opportunity, or gain useful information, etc. that you can choose. This seems like a great idea to me. I love the idea of these adventurers who have been putting themselves in extreme peril and just want to relax, kick back and let off some steam when they get to town. Rather like in the real world, how pirates in the ages of piracy used to spend all their time out on sea in combat in the harsh, unforgiving environment of the sea, making their money. Then on the rare occasions they did visit shore, they blow all this money in one night of partying and celebration, letting off steam. It's a great idea, and it's one I certainly plan to yoink for other games. I also get the feeling that some adventuring parties may be falling foul of the outstanding warrants move if they've caused trouble in the settlement in the past. But I'll leave that for GMs who want to spring that on their player characters. Chapter 5 is a list of example names, looks, stat reminders, and various class-specific moves. The class-specific moves are all very interesting, and I can see how they add a lot of flesh and interest to the skeleton of the world being constructed. They include things which will be familiar to D&D players as the powers of the various classes, such as a druid's ability to change shape, as well as things which would have been covered by feats in D&D or Pathfinder. Chapters 6 to 12 each cover a single class, looking at them in more detail. They're all very well written and very interesting, although the ad hoc deities and choice of traditions for the religion on the cleric section is a little generic for my mind, but given this that is a quick system, I at least applaud them for making an effort to include this in some manner. And to be honest, it really doesn't seem any more generic than D&D Spheres in my opinion. Characters accumulate advanced moves as they increase in level in a manner akin to feats, as mentioned earlier. Chapter 13 is a Games Master information chapter that contains some good information for both starting and more experienced GMs, and suggests a threefold mantra for the GM to bear in mind, which are 1. Portray a fantastic world. 2. Fill the characters' lives with adventure. 3. Play to find out what happens. It suggests that anything not included in these points should be disregarded, and goes on to encourage GMs not to think of themselves as the player's opposition, which is always a good piece of advice. It encourages the effort of the game to seem more like collaborative fiction, and as I've said before, the main purpose of RPGs is to entertain both the players and the GM. The game also suggests a list of principles to bear in mind. These are: draw maps, leave blanks, address the characters, not the players, embrace the fantastic, make a move that follows, never speak the name of your move, give every monster life, name every person, ask questions and use the answers, be a fan of the characters, think dangerously, begin and end with the fiction, and think off-screen too. The game then goes on to explore this list of principles in more detail. The advice given is great and obviously comes from people who've played and studied a number of role-playing games. I think this chapter contains a wealth of useful information and reminders for new and experienced GMs. There's certainly some suggestions in here that I'll be keeping in mind when running my own games in the future. A particular favourite part of this section for me is the part that deals with GMs asking questions to players and using their answers. The most basic of questions that a GM can ask a player is, what do you do next? And this is something I ask of my players a fair amount in my games, when players seem a bit unsure or when they're a bit hesitant. Often just asking them a direct question like that can get the game moving again. Or perhaps jumping briefly to another player character who isn't the main person in this scene, and getting some sense of how they're reacting to the events unfolding in front of them can be a good way of spurring a stalled scene on. I like that the concept of soft and hard moves have been codified in the game. Soft moves are something that reveals a little more of the game world and hints at future events, but doesn't provide any direct opposition or consequences, although it may lead to that if the players choose not to deal with it or ignore it. And hard moves being something that provides a direct challenge or a danger to the PCs. For example, a soft move might be, you hear the sound of marching feet coming down the road as the goblin horde approaches. And, if no attention is paid, this might lead to a hard move, such as, the first goblin troops march into the clearing and spring to the attack, hacking and slashing with their rusty iron blades. Chapter 14 addresses Games Master and session prep, advising the GM on what sort of things they'll either need or find useful for running a session. This is fairly sensible advice, and the game cautions the Dungeon World GM not to try and bring a planned storyline or plot to the game table, advising the GM to collaboratively build the world in concert with and around the players, designed by the players as the game progresses. I'm intrigued to see how this works in play, since I generally put a fair amount of prep in, and I'm interested in whether or not it's possible to run a more improvised style of game and yet still maintain a certain standard of quality. I've arranged a sample game for tomorrow evening with some friends of mine, and I hope to report back on the outcome of that once it's occurred. Dungeon World advises the Games Master to begin their first session in a tense, dramatic situation. Always a good idea. and let the players rely on their moves, links with each other, and their own role playing to get them out of it. I quite like the idea of the GM using this initial session and asking questions of the players to determine the future direction of the game. Using player input to direct the stories, rather than just having the GM dole out bits of plot from on high, sounds like a great idea to me. Chapter 15 introduces the concept of fronts. Now, fronts are something that you make after your first session and represents groupings of problems or challenges the players will face, some to be dealt with over the course of a few adventures and some stretching over the entire campaign. The chapter goes on to give some useful advice for organising the fronts in your game and adding the various creatures or elements that make up the front and that will impact on your campaign world. Dungeon World suggests using the game's move structure to point towards actions that the front could undertake. I love this idea. Fronts have one of the particular parts I like is that fronts have a series of steps christened Grim Portent, great title, that can be advanced by player or NPC action and ticked off one by one until eventually an impending doom occurs once they've all been ticked off. Note that once an impending doom has occurred, this doesn't necessarily spell the death knell of your campaign, but it does change it or alter it in some fundamental way. During the creation of a front, the GM comes up with 1 to 3 stake questions about people, places or groups that they're interested in, including both PCs and NPCs. The questions are related to the front and should be something concrete that can be found out in play. I love this idea since it paints a picture of both the GM and the players working together to discover the answers to the question. Chapter 16 discusses the world and visiting civilization away from adventuring sites. And to me, this conjured up images of the old computer RPGs, such as the Final Fantasies, etc., where players would explore a dungeon and then the view would zoom out to a world map when you left, or a town screen for the non-fighting or exploration parts of the game. Although the game Dungeon World does make it very clear that these outcroppings of civilization, called steadings in the game terminology, shouldn't become a permanent hideaway from a life of adventure, and the GM should use hard moves, if necessary, to bring adventure to the player characters. The approach to world building seems very much to be design as you go it along, revealing and expanding the world as the players and the GM define it through play. Adopting a similar approach to the rest of the game, rules are provided for designing steadings. They are defined by tags that cover what and who is available there, and aspects that can modify player dice rolls while in the place. Steadings should be marked on the steadily unfolding map, and each front should have a feature on the map that represents it. There are also some interesting ideas for reflecting the changing nature of towns and civilized holdings in the time between adventures. Chapter 17 deals with monsters, and this is a fairly standard monster bestiary which groups the monsters together into the sort of areas they may be found: haunted forest, hordes, etc. And the descriptions and stat blocks are short and concise, with the horde monsters such as orcs or gnolls having several different varieties covered, such as chieftain, archer, scout, etc. Although I wasn't precisely sure what, if any, effect some of the bullet pointed actions listed in the monster stat box would have. Now, I joined a Google Plus community called the Dungeon World Tavern, where I posted this question, and a couple of people were very kindly volunteered an answer, saying that these bullet points are actions that can be undertaken by the monsters. Although there are no rules attached to them, they offer guidelines to the GM for when certain situations occur involving the monsters as to what a monster's typical reaction might be. And this seems like a nice way of maintaining some consistency with the monsters and directing maybe a less experienced GM. Chapter 18 is a fairly standard equipment list. It's well written, but didn't really set my world on fire, but then again, very few equipment lists actually do. Although I think it could have stood to have some more interesting pictures of equipment in it. I'm always particularly fond of pictures which show what equipment actually looks like, since it's always good to make sure players are actually talking about the equipment they think they are. Chapter 19 is called the Advanced Delving chapter, and this discusses moves in more detail and how to create new moves and classes. It also covers compendium classes, which seem to occupy a similar niche to prestige classes in D&D. After this, there's a whole flotilla of appendixes which cover influences on the game, and there's an extremely large section listing all the various playtesters and people who were involved in the Kickstarter campaign to get Dungeon World off the ground. And fair played, I'm guessing part of the Kickstarter was getting your name included in the book, although the number of pages does seem a little excessive, but then again, I purchased a PDF, so I'm not too concerned about that. However, I can see it bumping the price of the actual printed book up. Overall, my verdict would be that Dungeon World is a very simple and easy to pick up game. I can see that character creation would take no more than 10 or 15 minutes tops, and straight away you could be jumping into a game of excitement and danger. As the game says, keep the player characters' lives dramatic. It also seems a great deal more versatile. My initial worry was that the game was going to be very samey, there wasn't going to be any real depth to it. However, I think despite the fact it's a very quick to pick up and run game, there's some really interesting advice in the GM chapters, and there's a lot of scope with the various moves and abilities you can acquire as you go up in level. All in all, I think this game seems to be currently on par, if not exceeding, what I've seen of the D&D Next 5th edition playtest materials, and certainly stands toe to toe with some of the more story based and enjoyable games that I've played recently. As I say, I'll be running a game tomorrow night for some of my friends, and I hope to report back on how that goes at the end of that. If you have any comments on Dungeon World, please leave them in the comments box below. I look forward to reading what you write. Perhaps you're an old hand at Dungeon World and you have some advice to offer me for running my game tomorrow. Perhaps you're interested in starting up a game of Dungeon World yourself, or perhaps you simply wish to ask some questions or know a little bit more about it. Either way, I look forward to reading what you've wrote.